Today, we journey to the shores where ancient deserts meet the epicenter of global power. In this video, we will trace the path of the Persian Gulf, from forgotten pearl fisheries to futuristic megacities balancing on the edge of a great war. You will learn how Portuguese cannons and British intrigue laid the foundation for the modern monarchies, and how the discovery of oil transformed a quiet periphery into the planet's main fuel station. We will examine the region's most intense conflicts, from the 8-year hell of the Iran-Iraq War to the fires of Desert Storm. And we will explain why ambitious dreams of cities of the future and missions to Mars are now colliding with the harsh reality of the 2026 crisis. Suggest new topics in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Here we talk about history, from ancient legends to modern tales, from historical facts to mysterious plots. Make yourself comfortable. We begin. The history of the Persian Gulf as an arena of global military confrontation began long before humanity learned of its oil wealth. At the end of the 15th century, this region became a primary target for European monarchies seeking to find a direct route to the fabulous riches of India and the Spice Islands. Until that moment, trade had moved through endless caravan routes or through intermediaries in Egypt, which made pepper, cinnamon, and silk unbelievably expensive goods in Europe. Whoever managed to control the narrow bottleneck of the Persian Gulf effectively received the keys to the world economy of that era. The first to break the silence of these waters were the Portuguese. In 1507, a squadron under the command of Afonso de Albuquerque approached the coast of Oman. The Portuguese possessed technical superiority in artillery and shipbuilding, which allowed them to seize key ports with great speed. The most important point was the island of Hormuz, which locked the entrance to the Gulf. Albuquerque understood the strategic importance of this place and ordered the construction of a powerful stone fortress there. The walls of that fort were meant to become a symbol of the permanence of Portuguese domination. Local rulers and merchants found themselves in a difficult position. The Portuguese crown introduced a pass system for all ships entering these waters. Any vessel without official permission was subject to attack and its cargo was confiscated. It was the first attempt in the history of the region to fully monopolize the sea routes through force and arms. The Portuguese held dominance for more than 100 years, methodically suppressing any attempts of resistance from the local emirates and from the Ottoman Empire, which also laid claim to these territories. However, by the beginning of the 17th century, the balance of power began to change. New players appeared on the horizon: the Netherlands and England. These countries created powerful trading organizations known as the East India Companies. Unlike the Portuguese, who relied on direct military presence and religious expansion, the English and the Dutch acted more flexibly, forging temporary alliances with local forces. In 1622, an event occurred that dealt a mortal blow to Portuguese influence. The English fleet joined forces with the army of Shah Abbas I of Persia in the siege of Hormuz. After a long siege, the fortress fell, and the Portuguese were finally expelled from this part of the Gulf. Victory over a common enemy did not bring peace. On the contrary, it opened a period of bitter struggle between the former allies. The English and the Dutch entered a prolonged conflict for the right to become the principal trading agents in the region. At the height of its power, the Dutch East India Company possessed an enormous fleet and a network of fortified factories. They sought to control the export of sugar and textiles, and they also actively interfered in the affairs of the rulers of Bahrain and the coastal regions of modern-day Iran. Competition was so intense that trading agents often turned to direct sabotage and the capture of one another's ships. By the middle of the 18th century, the Dutch influence began to fade gradually because of the company's internal economic problems and wars in Europe. This gave the British Empire the opportunity to establish itself in the Persian Gulf once and for all. The British realized that control over this region was necessary not only for trade, but also to ensure the security of their main colonial possessions in India. The Gulf was viewed as a forward line of defense. Any appearance of a hostile fleet in these waters was perceived in London as a direct threat to the British Crown. This entire period was characterized by constant naval clashes. There were not many large-scale land battles, since the main forces of the Europeans were concentrated on the water. Local tribes, watching the collisions of the great powers, learned to maneuver between them, sometimes supporting one side in order to weaken the other. However, the superiority of European artillery and the discipline of regular fleets gradually transformed the rulers of the coast from sovereign players into dependent allies. It is important to note that during this period, the main value of the region remained its geographical position. The Strait of Hormuz was that narrow place where the interests of East and West collided. Every fortification built on the rocky shores of Muscat or on the islands of the Gulf served one purpose: domination over the flow of goods. Domination over water meant domination over wealth. It was precisely in those centuries that the tradition of foreign military presence was established, a presence that would determine the fate of these lands over the centuries to come. By the end of the 18th century, the English became the dominant force, but their position was not secure. New centers of power began to form along the coast, made up of warlike tribal confederations. These communities possessed their own fleets and had no desire to recognize the dictates of European companies. A clash of interests between British bureaucracy and local seafarers was inevitable. It marked the transition from the age of great imperial discoveries to a period of long and exhausting colonial wars. Thus, Portuguese caravels, Dutch fluits, and English men of war turned the waters of the Gulf into a zone of constant tension. The inhabitants of the coast were drawn into a global game in which their lands were used as supply points for fleets and for the protection of caravans. This foundation of outside interference predetermined many future crises, when external powers would come to the Gulf again and again, driven by their own geopolitical interests. At the beginning of the 19th century, the Persian Gulf turned into one of the most dangerous places on the map of the world. After the European powers weakened their control over the coastal waters, the initiative passed to the local Arab tribes. The most powerful force in this period was the Qawasim tribal confederation. They were based in the ports of Ras Al Khaimah and Sharjah. These people were hereditary seafarers and skillful warriors. They created an impressive fleet made up of hundreds of fast vessels armed with cannons. For the British East India Company, whose trade routes from India to Europe passed through these waters, the activity of the Qawasim became a true disaster. British historians of that time called this territory the Pirate Coast. Yet for the local inhabitants, this was a struggle for survival and for control over their own resources. The conflict intensified when Arab vessels began attacking large British ships carrying valuable cargo and mail. One of the first major clashes took place in 1809. That year, a British frigate engaged in battle with an entire flotilla of local vessels. This clash showed that traditional methods of naval warfare did not always work against agile Arab boats, which knew perfectly well the shallows and reefs of the Gulf. The situation became critical in 1812. Attacks on British ships became regular. This caused enormous economic damage to the empire. London made the decision to send a full punitive expedition into the Gulf. In November of that same year, a British fleet under the command of John Wainwright approached Ras Al Khaimah. The city was subjected to massive bombardment from heavy guns. Landing detachments came ashore and burned hundreds of vessels standing in the harbor. However, this demonstration of force did not bring the long-awaited peace. The tribes quickly restored their strength and moved their bases to more protected places. Over the next 10 years, the tension only grew. The British understood that one-off actions would not solve the problem. They needed complete control over the coast. In 1819, a second, more large-scale expedition was organized. This time, the British deployed 3,000 soldiers and several powerful warships. After fierce fighting, Ras Al Khaimah fell once again. British engineers blew up all the stone fortifications of the city in order to deprive the local inhabitants of any possibility of future defense. January of 1820 became a turning point in the history of the region. Under the barrels of British guns, the sheikhs of the coastal tribes were forced to sign the General Treaty of Peace. This document officially prohibited piracy and the slave trade in the waters of the Gulf. Britain took upon itself the role of supreme arbiter and protector of the maritime routes. It was then that the name Pirate Coast gradually began to disappear from the maps, yielding its place to the name Trucial Oman. However, the establishment of peace was a long and difficult process. Local leaders often violated the terms of the treaty, entering into internecine wars at sea. Every such violation triggered a harsh reaction from the British political resident in Bushehr. The British practiced a system of fines and temporary blockades of ports. In 1835, the first agreement on maritime truce during the pearl diving season was signed. This was necessary because conflicts between the tribes interfered with the main industry that fed thousands of families. In 1853, this agreement evolved into a treaty of perpetual peace. The tribes undertook to cease all military actions at sea forever. All disputes now had to be resolved through a British mediator. This treaty effectively turned the region into a closed zone of British influence. Other European powers were deprived of the opportunity to establish themselves here. Britain established a regime of strict guardianship over the local rulers. The conflicts of the 19th century had deep consequences for the social structure of the region. The traditional way of life of the seafaring communities began to change. Tribes that had once lived by raids and free trade were forced to switch to peaceful occupations. The main source of income became the pearl trade. This created a new economic dependence on global markets. At the same time, the British presence brought relative stability. Bloody clashes between clans at sea became rare because British warships were watching over the order. The British did not interfere in the internal affairs of the tribes on land. They were interested only in the security of the waterway. This created a strange situation in which old disputes over oases and wells continued on land while colonial order reigned at sea. Local sheikhs began to realize the advantages of cooperation with a great power. British recognition gave legitimacy to their authority within their domains. Thus were laid the foundations of the future monarchies we see today. By the end of the 19th century, the British pacification was complete. The region became the strategic rear of the Indian Empire. Any attempts by outside forces or local leaders to challenge this domination were suppressed at their very birth. The conflicts of this period transformed the Gulf from a zone of chaos into a zone of strict control. This order endured until geologists arrived on the coast with equipment to search for oil. But the story of the struggle for black gold is already the next page in the chronicle of the region. The 19th century left behind the memory of brutal battles and burned cities. It taught the local inhabitants that the force of arms defines political reality. For Britain, this experience became a lesson in governing complex and warlike territories through a system of treaties and the demonstration of naval power. Piracy was defeated, but the causes that had given birth to the conflicts did not disappear. They merely transformed, waiting for a new reason to explode, a reason that in the future would become territorial disputes and the struggle for natural resources. It was precisely at this time that the political geography of the modern Gulf Coast was formed. The boundaries of tribal interests recorded in British reports would later become the basis for state borders. The pacification of the pirate coast was the first step on the path towards transforming scattered nomadic communities into organized state structures under strict external supervision.
For a long time, the borders in the deserts of the Persian Gulf existed only conditionally. Nomadic tribes moved between wells and pastures, paying no attention to the invisible lines on the map. The situation changed dramatically in the 1930s, when geologists began to find the first signs of giant oil deposits. In a single moment, lifeless sands acquired colossal value. This led to the emergence of fierce conflicts between local rulers and the world powers standing behind them. Every meter of desert became the subject of armed clashes and legal disputes. The first signal of the new era was the discovery of oil in Bahrain in 1932. Soon after that, geologists confirmed the presence of enormous reserves in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. The rulers of the neighboring emirates realized that their future would depend on how much land they could officially secure for themselves. The British Empire, which still controlled the foreign policy of the region, found itself in a difficult position. It had to draw clear borders where none had ever existed. This gave rise to a chain of territorial disputes, some of which remain unresolved to this day. The most vivid and dangerous conflict of this period was the dispute over the Al-Bahraini oasis. This area stood at the intersection of the interests of Saudi Arabia, the Emirate of Abu Dhabi, and the Sultan of Oman. In the early 50s, Saudi Arabia declared its claims to this territory. Behind it stood the American oil company Aramco, which was seeking to expand the zone of its exploration work. On the other side stood Abu Dhabi and Oman, whose interests were defended by the British company Petroleum Development. The oasis turned into a battlefield for two oil giants and two great powers. In 1952, a Saudi armed detachment occupied one of the villages in the oasis. This provoked an immediate reaction from Britain. Long and fruitless diplomatic negotiations began. The British understood that losing Al-Bahraini would mean losing control over potential oil fields for their companies. In 1955, London's patience ran out. A military operation was carried out with the participation of the Trucial Oman levies under the command of British officers. Saudi forces were driven out of the oasis. This incident poisoned relations between Riyadh and its neighbors for an entire decade. Oil companies played the role of grey eminences in these conflicts. They financed the sheikh's legal teams, hired cartographers and historians to search for evidence that one tribe or another had once paid tribute to a particular ruler. Often the evidence consisted of old men's oral traditions or records of livestock taxes collected 100 years earlier. Borders were drawn on the basis of where exactly a company planned to place a drilling rig. If exploration showed there was no oil, interest in the disputed territory faded instantly. Another center of tension was Kuwait. Iraq had always looked with suspicion at the autonomy of this small but incredibly rich neighbor. When oil was found in Kuwait in 1938 at the Bergen field, Baghdad's claims grew louder. Iraqi leaders argued that Kuwait had historically been part of their territory. This created a permanent threat of invasion, forcing the rulers of Kuwait to seek protection from the British Crown. Each newly discovered field only increased the risk of aggression from more powerful neighbors. Internal conflicts also tore the region apart. In Oman in the 50s, war broke out in the Jebel Akhtar Mountains. The head of the local religious imamat, supported by Saudi Arabia, rose against the Sultan in Muscat, who was supported by Britain. The true cause of the uprising was the struggle for the right to grant oil concessions in the country's interior. The war was brutal and required the direct intervention of the British Air Force and Special Forces to suppress the rebels. It was a typical example of how the pursuit of black oil destroyed traditional political alliances. By the beginning of the 60s, the region had turned into a labyrinth of disputed zones. Maritime boundaries, too, became a matter of conflict. The Gulf's continental shelf concealed even greater wealth than the land itself. The dispute between Iran, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia over control of offshore fields led to the need for complex international agreements. Yet these agreements were often broken as soon as one side discovered a promising new structure on the seabed. Technological progress in drilling only poured oil on the flames of geopolitical rivalry. The struggle for oil changed the rulers themselves. Yesterday they had been leaders of poor nomadic tribes. Today they had become the masters of billion-dollar fortunes. This wealth allowed them to purchase modern weapons, making any border skirmish far more dangerous. The arms race in the Gulf began just when the first tankers started carrying oil to Europe and America. Oil gave them money for an army, and an army was needed to protect the oil fields. This vicious circle determined the character of the region for many decades. It is important to note that the oil conflicts of this period were not merely local. They drew the Soviet Union and the United States into their orbit, both of which sought to secure their strategic interests. The Gulf became one of the most important chessboards of the Cold War. Every movement of a border or every change of regime in one of the countries of the region was immediately reflected in global energy prices. The stability of supply became the highest priority for the West, and that priority was used to justify almost any intervention in the internal affairs of Arab states. Thus, the dream of wealth turned for many peoples into years of anxiety and military presence. Oil created the modern Gulf state, but it also laid delayed action mines beneath its foundations in the form of unresolved territorial claims. By the end of the 60s, it became clear that the old colonial order was disappearing, and in its place there was coming a new and even harsher struggle for dominance in this strategic region. The year 1979 became, for the Persian Gulf, a moment of tectonic shift, the consequences of which continue to shape the life of the region to this very day. Before that time, the political structure of the Gulf had seemed relatively stable. It rested on the so-called Twin Pillars policy pursued by the United States of America. Those pillars were Saudi Arabia and Iran under the rule of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The Shah possessed the most powerful army in the region and acted as the policeman of the Gulf, ensuring the security of maritime routes and containing Soviet influence. Yet, within a matter of months, that entire system collapsed. The events in Iran began with mass protests against the Shah's regime. Despite its outward grandeur and enormous oil revenues, Iranian society suffered from social inequality and the harsh suppression of political freedoms. In February, the Shah was forced to leave the country, and Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini came to power. This was not merely a change of government, it was the birth of an entirely new form of state, the Islamic Republic. For the first time in the modern history of the region, religious leaders came to power, openly declaring their intention to export their revolution to neighboring Arab countries. For the Arab monarchies on the opposite shore of the Gulf, this came as a shock. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates suddenly saw in Iran not a reliable partner, but a mortal threat. The ideology of the new Iranian regime called into question the very legitimacy of monarchic rule. Khomeini argued that monarchy was contrary to the principles of Islam and that the peoples of the region should follow Iran's example. This created an atmosphere of deep distrust and fear. Every statement from Tehran was perceived in Riyadh as a direct call for the overthrow of the royal family. Particular alarm was caused by the situation in countries where significant Shiite populations lived. In Iraq, Bahrain, and the eastern provinces of Saudi Arabia, unrest began. People inspired by the success of the Iranian Revolution demanded greater rights and change. In '79, Saudi Arabia faced an unprecedented challenge within its own borders. A group of armed radicals seized the Grand Mosque in Mecca. Although the attackers were not supporters of Iran, the incident revealed the vulnerability of the Saudi regime and forced the authorities towards an even greater radicalization of domestic policy in order to protect their foundations. At the same time, another event occurred that intensified the tension. The United States lost its principal ally in the person of the Iranian Shah. The seizure of American hostages at the embassy in Tehran in November 1979 finally severed diplomatic relations between the two countries. Iran transformed from a guarantor of stability into the West's principal adversary in the region. This forced the American leadership to seek new ways of protecting its interests and ensuring uninterrupted oil supplies. The Persian Gulf officially became a zone of vital interest to Washington, one for which it was prepared to fight. The reaction of the Arab states to the Iranian threat was swift. They began a process of consolidation. Soon after the revolution, the leaders of the 6 monarchies began negotiations on the creation of a union that might withstand Tehran's ambitions. This led to the formation of the Gulf Cooperation Council. This alliance included Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, and Oman. The main purpose of the union was coordination in matters of defense and security. The small emirates understood that alone they would not be able to resist a large and aggressive neighbor. At the same time, Saddam Hussein came to power in Iraq. He saw in the chaos that had engulfed post-revolutionary Iran an opportunity to establish his own leadership in the Arab world. Saddam presented himself as the defender of the Arabs against Persian expansion. He began actively strengthening the army and preparing for a conflict which in his view would be swift and victorious. The Arab monarchs, although they also feared Saddam's own ambitions, began to provide him with financial support, seeing Iraq as a necessary buffer between themselves and revolutionary Iran. Ideological confrontation took on the character of a Cold War. Radio stations in Tehran and Baghdad waged a continuous propaganda war, accusing one another of betraying the interests of the faithful.
Iran actively supported Shiite opposition groups in Arab countries, while the Arab states supported ethnic minorities within Iran itself. This was a struggle for influence over the minds of millions. The border running through the middle of the Persian Gulf became not merely a geographical divide, but the front line in a clash of two visions of the future of the Islamic world. By the end of '79, the region had finally split into two camps. On one side stood Iran, striving for the radical transformation of the Middle East. On the other side stood the Arab monarchs supported by the West and by Iraq, who sought to preserve the status quo. Trust had been completely lost. Any diplomatic gesture or military exercise was perceived as preparation for aggression. Enormous oil revenues were now directed not only towards infrastructure development, but also towards the purchase of the latest weapon systems. '79 brought to an end the era of colonial and post-colonial calm in the Gulf. It triggered a chain reaction of conflicts that would torment the region for the next 40 years. The revolution in Iran changed not only the political system of one country, it created a new reality in which religion and politics were bound together in an inseparable knot. The Persian Gulf ceased to be merely a trade route, it became the epicenter of a global struggle for ideological dominance. That tension reached its limit in September 1980, when the guns finally spoke for real, beginning one of the bloodiest wars of modern times. It was the events of that year that forced the world to realize the fragility of the global energy system. Any spark was instantly reflected in fuel prices in Europe and America. Political instability in Iran showed that even the strongest alliances could collapse in a matter of weeks. The region entered a period of long and exhausting struggle, where the cost of a mistake was measured in millions of lives and trillions of dollars.
On the 22nd of September 1980, the Persian Gulf trembled with the thunder of artillery. Iraqi troops, acting on the orders of Saddam Hussein, crossed the border into Iran, hoping for a quick and easy victory over a country consumed by revolutionary chaos. But that calculation proved deeply mistaken. Instead of a lightning triumph, the region received one of the longest and bloodiest wars of the century. This conflict quickly moved beyond land battles and spilled into the waters of the Gulf, placing the world's energy security under threat. The first years of the war were marked by positional battles that resembled the First World War. Soldiers on both sides died in endless assaults against fortified lines. Yet by the middle of the 1980s, it became clear that neither side could achieve a decisive advantage on land. Then Iraq decided to transfer the fighting to the sea. Saddam Hussein's goal was to undermine Iran's economy by destroying its ability to export oil. Thus began the era that entered history under the name of the Tanker War. Iraqi aircraft began attacking merchant vessels entering Iranian ports using modern French-made Exocet missiles. Iran did not remain in debt. Lacking the ability to effectively fight Iraqi aircraft, it began launching retaliatory strikes on tankers carrying oil from Arab states that supported Iraq. Vessels of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia came under attack. Iranian boats and frigates used the tactics of rapid strikes and the mining of international waters. The Gulf became a zone of death for civilian sailors. Captains of ships from Europe, Japan, and America were forced to guide their vessels through minefields, constantly expecting a missile strike or an attack by the speedboats of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. By the end of the 1980s, the situation had reached the breaking point.
Kuwait, whose tankers were under constant attack, appealed to the great powers for help. The United States made an unprecedented decision. It agreed to re-flag Kuwaiti vessels under the American flag and provide them with military escort. This operation was called Earnest Will. The U.S. Navy began openly patrolling the Gulf, entering into direct clashes with Iranian forces. It was the first large-scale combat use of the American fleet since Vietnam. One of the most tragic episodes of this confrontation was the incident involving the American frigate Stark. An Iraqi aircraft, mistakenly identifying it as an Iranian tanker, fired 2 missiles. As a result, 37 American sailors were killed. Despite the fact that the attack had been carried out by a formal ally, the United States placed responsibility for the escalation on Iran. This led to a series of punitive operations by the American fleet against Iranian oil platforms, which were being used as bases for patrol boats and radar stations. The naval war was accompanied by horrifying events on land. It was during this period that the world, for the first time in many years, witnessed the massive use of chemical weapons. Iraqi forces used poison gas against Iranian soldiers and against civilians. The images from the city of Halabja, where thousands died from exposure to nerve agents, shocked the international community. Yet geopolitical interests forced the great powers to look away from these crimes because Iran was regarded as the more dangerous enemy. Soon another catastrophe occurred, one that accelerated the end of the conflict. The American cruiser Vincennes mistakenly shot down an Iranian passenger airliner over the Strait of Hormuz. 290 people were killed, including 66 children. This tragedy showed that the level of tension in the region had reached a point beyond which an uncontrollable global war might follow. Ayatollah Khomeini was forced to admit that Iran could no longer continue the struggle under such conditions. A ceasefire agreement was signed. The war ended where it had begun, along the line of the old border. Neither Iraq nor Iran gained any territorial acquisitions. The price of those 8 years of hell was hundreds of thousands of dead on both sides and trillions of dollars in economic damage. The region lay in ruins. Coastal cities were shattered, ports were clogged with the wreckage of sunken ships, and the oil infrastructure would require decades to recover. The consequences of the tanker war were colossal. It forever changed the methods of providing security in the Gulf. The great powers understood that they could not rely on local leaders and would have to keep their fleets in these waters permanently. The United States finally established itself in the region as the principal military power. The Arab monarchies, for their part, realized their extreme vulnerability. They spent years rearming their armies, purchasing the most expensive and modern defense systems, and this provoked a new wave of the arms race. For Iran, the war became a time of national unity, but at the same time a time of deep isolation. Revolutionary zeal collided with the brutal reality of modern warfare. The country found itself cut off from Western technology and financial markets, and that determined its dальнейший path of development for many years ahead. For Iraq, however, the war became the beginning of the end. Saddam Hussein, with a huge but exhausted army and colossal debts to his neighbors, began searching for a new way out of the crisis. His gaze turned towards rich Kuwait, which soon led to a new explosion of violence. This chapter in the history of the Persian Gulf teaches us that in such conflicts there are no winners. The war of the 1980s resolved not a single one of the region's political or religious contradictions. On the contrary, it only hardened hearts and created the ground for future crises. The mutual hatred born from chemical attacks and strikes on cities became the foundation upon which the politics of the Gulf would be built in the decades that followed. The sea that had once fed people through the pearl trade was transformed for 8 long years into a graveyard for ships and men. The tanker war showed the entire world just how vulnerable modern civilization is in the face of conflict in this narrow strait. Every drop of oil passing through Hormuz has carried ever since the memory of those 8 years of hell when fire and steel ruled the waters of the Gulf.
After the end of the exhausting war with Iran, Iraq found itself in a catastrophic economic position. The country's external debt was measured in tens of billions of dollars. A significant portion of that money Baghdad owed to its own neighbors. Saddam Hussein believed that the Arab monarchies should forgive those debts because Iraq, in his view, had spent 8 years defending them from the Iranian threat. But Kuwait refused to cancel the debt, and it also refused Iraq's demand to reduce oil production in order to raise world prices. This confrontation quickly grew from a financial dispute into an act of armed aggression that forever changed the political landscape of the Persian Gulf. On the 2nd of August 1990, Iraqi armored divisions crossed the border of Kuwait. The tiny state could offer no serious resistance to Saddam's vast army. In only a few hours, Kuwait was occupied. The emir and the government fled to Saudi Arabia. Baghdad declared Kuwait to be Iraq's 19th province. This event shocked the entire world. For the first time in modern history, one Arab state had completely conquered and attempted to annex another sovereign Arab state, which was also a member of the United Nations. The international community reacted with unprecedented speed and unity. The United Nations Security Council imposed harsh economic sanctions on Iraq. The United States began deploying troops to Saudi Arabia in order to protect the kingdom from a possible further advance by Iraqi forces. This defensive phase was called Desert Shield. Saddam Hussein was given an ultimatum: withdraw the troops by the 15th of January 1991. But the Iraqi leader ignored the demands of the world community, hoping that the West would not dare launch a large-scale ground war in the sands. On the 17th of January 1991, a coalition of 34 states, led by the United States, began Operation Desert Storm. Iraq was struck by a storm of high-technology attacks. For the first time, the world watched live as guided missiles and stealth aircraft were used in war. The air campaign lasted 5 weeks and completely destroyed Iraq's military infrastructure and command system. Despite Saddam's attempts to draw Israel into the war through Scud missile attacks and to provoke an ecological catastrophe by setting oil wells on fire, the international coalition remained united. The ground phase of the operation began at the end of February and lasted only 100 hours. The Iraqi army, once considered the 4th largest in the world, was completely crushed. Kuwait was liberated. Yet the consequences of this war reached far beyond the simple restoration of one state's sovereignty. Desert Storm marked the end of the era of Arab solidarity. The fact that Arab countries such as Egypt, Syria, and Saudi Arabia fought in one coalition alongside Western powers against another Arab state destroyed the myth of shared unity. For Iraq itself, defeat became the beginning of a long period of isolation and civil suffering under the weight of international sanctions. Shiite uprisings in the south and Kurdish uprisings in the north broke out inside the country, and they were brutally crushed by troops loyal to Saddam. The Gulf region became a place of constant patrols of international aircraft enforcing no-fly zones. The continued presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia after the war caused deep resentment in conservative Muslim circles and became one of the causes behind the rise of radical sentiment across the Islamic world. The economic consequences of the conflict were catastrophic. As they withdrew from Kuwait, Iraqi troops set fire to more than 600 oil wells. Enormous columns of black smoke blocked out the sun for months, while oil lakes in the desert and spills in the waters of the Gulf inflicted irreparable damage to nature. It was the first war in history in which the environment itself was used as a weapon of mass destruction. Eliminating the consequences of those fires required the efforts of engineers from around the world and took many long years. The conflict over Kuwait also changed the security system of the region. The Arab monarchies finally became convinced that they could not defend themselves on their own. This led to the signing of long-term defense agreements with the United States and Great Britain. Massive foreign military bases appeared in Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain. The Gulf effectively turned into a military protectorate of the West. This ensured the stability of oil supplies, but at the same time made the region a target for those opposed to foreign intervention. The war for Kuwait showed that the time of local wars in the Gulf had ended. Any change in borders within this sensitive region now triggered an immediate global reaction. Saddam Hussein remained in power, but his country had been drained of blood and stripped of the ability to play a leading role in the Arab world. The vacuum of power that emerged after Iraq's weakening gradually began to be filled by another major player, Iran. This created the conditions for a new round of rivalry that would unfold in the 21st century. It is important to emphasize that Operation Desert Storm became a triumph of modern military technology and international law. But it did not bring final peace to the region. It merely froze the conflict, leaving unresolved the deep social and political contradictions. Kuwait's borders were restored, but trust between neighbors was permanently broken. The Persian Gulf entered a new era, one in which foreign military presence became a permanent factor, and the expectation of another great war became part of everyday life. The lessons of the 1990s showed that the Gulf's wealth and resources are not only a guarantee of prosperity, but also a constant source of temptation for aggressors. The decade that began with the seizure of Kuwait ended in an atmosphere of anxious agitation. It became clear that old methods of diplomacy no longer worked, and that stability in the region was now maintained exclusively by the overwhelming military superiority of outside powers. In the 21st century, the Persian Gulf became the arena for a new type of confrontation, one often described as a regional Cold War. The main actors in this conflict were Saudi Arabia and the Islamic Republic of Iran. If in the 20th century wars in the region were mainly shaped by direct aggression between states, the modern era brought with it the tactics of indirect confrontation. Two powerful centers of influence began struggling for leadership in the Middle East, using political influence, vast financial resources, and support for armed groups in third countries. This rivalry deeply divided the Muslim world and turned the Gulf into one of the most militarized places on the planet, creating the conditions for future catastrophes. The roots of this confrontation reach far back into the past, but it received a new impulse after the fall of Saddam Hussein's regime in 2003. The disappearance of the Iraqi barrier allowed Iran to sharply expand its influence, creating the so-called Shiite crescent from Tehran to the shores of the Mediterranean.
For Saudi Arabia and its allies, this meant strategic encirclement. The response was an unprecedented arms race. The Arab monarchies began spending hundreds of billions of dollars on the purchase of the latest defense systems, turning the Gulf Coast into an unbroken chain of fortified zones. Yet the main blows were delivered not directly, but through proxy conflicts, which became a testing ground for the weapons of the future. The bloodiest expression of this Cold War was the conflict in Yemen. Since 2015, the coalition led by Saudi Arabia has confronted the Houthi movement, behind which stood Iran. That war showed the world a new reality. Cheap drones and ballistic missiles had become capable of striking oil facilities deep into the territory of the richest monarchy in the world. Yemen became a preview of what the wars of the future would look like: asymmetrical, high-tech, and merciless towards civilian infrastructure. Every drone attack on Saudi facilities was not merely a military operation, but a demonstration of the vulnerability of the entire global energy system. At the same time, the struggle for influence was unfolding in Bahrain and Iraq. In 2011, Saudi Arabia was forced to send troops into Bahrain in order to prevent a regime change, which Riyadh believed to be the work of Iranian intelligence. This finally cemented the division of the region into two irreconcilable camps. The border running through the middle of the Persian Gulf turned into a front line where every movement, whether a military exercise or the construction of a new base, provoked an immediate reaction on the opposite shore. Oil revenues were now spent not only on social development, but also on the creation of cyber armies capable of paralyzing an opponent without a single shot. An important feature of this Cold War was the erosion of old alliances. The Arab monarchies, seeing Iran's growing power and the not always predictable policy of the West, began searching for new ways to guarantee their security. This led first to secret contacts and then to open ties with Israel, which in 2020 resulted in the signing of the Abraham Accords. Shared fear of Tehran forced long-standing enemies to unite. The region began turning into a complex system of military alliances where even the smallest mistake of one player could trigger a chain reaction and a full-scale explosion. By the middle of the 2020s, the tension had reached its limit. Diplomatic attempts at reconciliation, undertaken through the mediation of China and Iraq, brought only temporary relief. Proxy wars were exhausting resources, while the technological superiority of the Arab monarchies in aviation was balanced by the advantage of Iran in missile technology and unmanned systems. The Gulf came to resemble a tightened string, vibrating with every incident in the Strait of Hormuz. Over 20 years of rivalry, the region accumulated a critical mass of weapons and mutual grievances. This Cold War created all the conditions for local conflicts to grow into something far greater. Traditional methods of warfare were passing into the past, giving way to hybrid threats and drone attacks. The world held its breath, waiting to see where exactly the final rupture would occur. And that rupture came where it was least expected, inside the Arab camp itself, becoming the prelude to the vast crisis that unfolded in 2026. It is important to understand that the Cold War between Saudi Arabia and Iran was not merely a dispute for leadership. It became the catalyst for the complete transformation of the Gulf into a zone where peace is maintained only by the balance of fear. This atmosphere of distrust and permanent readiness for war made it possible the later diplomatic blockade of neighboring states and led to the fact that today the sky above the Gulf is once again darkened by the smoke of fires and the straits are closed to merchant shipping. In the 21st century, conflicts in the Persian Gulf have taken on new and more sophisticated forms. Direct clashes between armies have been joined by the methods of hybrid war, cyber attacks, information blockades, and the use of unmanned systems. The first serious signal that a deep split had emerged within the Arab world was the crisis surrounding Qatar. In June 2017, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt announced a complete rupture of diplomatic relations with Doha. Qatar found itself under an unprecedented land, sea, and air blockade. Its neighbors accused it of supporting radical movements and maintaining excessively close ties with Iran. This conflict lasted for more than 3 years and showed how modern technology can be used to destabilize an entire country. The trigger for the blockade was the hacking of Qatar's state news agency, through which false statements were planted in the name of the emir. In response, Doha was forced to rebuild its economy at extraordinary speed, establish new trade routes through Turkey and Iran, and even fly in thousands of cows by aircraft to ensure food security. The crisis ended only in January 2021 with the signing of an agreement, but it left deep scars on the body of Arab unity. Yet the true nightmare for the region remained the threat of closing the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow bottleneck through which 1/5 of the world's oil consumption passes. In recent years, Iran has turned that threat into its main instrument of influence. It has actively developed the tactics of asymmetric war, relying on swarms of fast attack boats and thousands of cheap kamikaze drones. These tools made it possible to strike painful blows on tankers and oil terminals while remaining in the shadows. Every escalation in the Gulf was accompanied by ship seizures and mysterious explosions aboard commercial vessels, forcing the world to watch every movement in those waters with growing anxiety. The situation reached boiling point at the end of February 2026. After a series of mutual accusations and precision strikes, the United States and Israel launched a large-scale air operation against Iranian military targets. Today, we are witnessing the Third Gulf War. It is a conflict of unprecedented intensity, in which the main actors are not only missiles, but autonomous combat systems as well. In early March, the Iranian command officially declared the Strait of Hormuz closed. To back up its words, Iran used hundreds of underwater mines and new types of naval drones. The events of the first weeks of March shocked global markets. U.S. Treasury forces destroyed 16 Iranian mine-laying vessels that were attempting to completely block the passage of oil tankers. In response, drone strikes hit oil facilities in Ras Tanura and industrial cities in Qatar. Companies around the world are reporting disruptions in supply chains, and the price of Brent crude crossed $90 a barrel within just days. Gulf airlines were forced to cancel hundreds of flights because of the constant threat of missile strikes and electronic warfare systems that make navigation impossible. The current conflict has shown that the old methods of deterrence no longer work. Drones, once seen as weapons of local skirmishes, have become instruments of strategic warfare. They are capable of overwhelming air defense systems and delivering precise strikes on civil infrastructure in Dubai and Manama. The smart cities of the Gulf have collided with the reality of total technological war. While Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates seek to carry out their futuristic development strategies, the current crisis is forcing them to throw all their strength into survival under the direct threat of their very existence. Despite the ferocity of the fighting, the first signs of back-channel diplomacy have begun to appear. The great powers, including China, which has a vital interest in stable supplies, have begun putting pressure on all sides of the conflict. The main lesson of the latest events is that in the modern world it is impossible to isolate a local conflict in a place of such strategic importance. Any spark in Hormuz instantly becomes a global fire, affecting every person on the planet. As we conclude the story of the Persian Gulf, we see that this region remains a hostage to its geography and its resources. From the first British frigates of the 19th century to the kamikaze drones of today, the struggle for control over these waters has never ceased. The future of the Gulf depends on whether it can outgrow the age of war and transform its strategic passage from a curse into a bridge for global cooperation. But for now, as long as the sky above the Gulf still echoes with the roar of combat aircraft and tankers remain at anchor awaiting the clearing of the strait, the world waits in suspense for the outcome of this new and most dangerous chapter in the region's history. The history of the Persian Gulf is a chronicle of endurance and ambition. Having passed through blockades, sanctions, and full-scale wars, the peoples of these shores continue to look ahead. And whatever the outcome of the present crisis, one thing is clear: the fate of this small stretch of the world ocean will continue to shape the fate of all human civilization in the 21st century.